I'll go ahead and call the March 18th, 2024 Public Safety Committee meeting to order. Appreciate everyone's patience. We're running a little bit late. But the first order of business, I believe, is the approval of the minutes of our last meeting. If everyone had a chance to review, is there a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved.
Moved. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. So approved. And then the only other order of business we have this evening is an ordinance to amend sections 513, various sections in 513 of our code related to the gift of marijuana and possession of marijuana as it relates to our criminal code. And this is part of the initiated statute that passed overwhelmingly in Lakewood last year for adult use of marijuana in our state. Councilman Schachtner proposed this ordinance along with two other ones. The two other ones more so deal with land use and zoning, but this one deals with our code. The original draft of this ordinance simply decriminalized it and then also had some court cost language. However, the administration has also been working on this ordinance to more align it with state law, which is in a state of flux right now in the sense that the initiated statute in some ways conflicts with the state criminal code, and there are provisions that are a little bit confusing. So it is still a work in progress, but I do think it is ripe to discuss kind of the high-level issues associated with it, and where our law department, and particularly our chief prosecutor, Miranda, is on her review of the code, both the state code and our local code, and how we can marry those two to hear the will of particularly Lakewood voters, but voters statewide, to decriminalize adult use marijuana, but then making sure we can thoughtfully amend our criminal code to reflect the realities on the ground. And we actually just got another version of this amended ordinance that is not quite a substitute ordinance, because I believe the administration still wants some more time to work on it. And there may be some changes that would further happen. But at this point, I think I would like to turn it over to Director Vargo and Chief Prosecutor Miranda to go through at a high level kind of their intent on the changes that they're going to propose to these provisions, and maybe put them into buckets so we could have a little bit of a policy discussion about it and what council would maybe want to see out of it. So then when we actually get to having a substitute ordinance, that council's policy desires, as much as they can marry with state code and the intent of both the initiated statute and what we want to see in Lakewood. So I'll throw it over to Director Vargo and Chief Prosecutor Miranda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just as an overview, along the lines that we spoke of in our first committee meeting on this, the Law Department is responding to a draft piece of legislation issued or initiated by council. And what we did the first time is analyze that, and we had several lawyers in the Law Department work on the language. And we had drafting sessions involving 4 of us, and the result of that first drafting session was the draft that was submitted to this committee in February. We made it clear then that we were not proposing that as a substitute, but rather work in progress. It needed continued work and continued attention to make sure the items are consistent with and among each other. Since that time, since that last meeting, Ms. Miranda has taken the lead, as she did the first time, on the criminal side of the legislation. And Ms. Swallow has taken the lead on the commerce side, which we'll talk about at the next committee meeting. But we had we get the draft from the people who own it in the first instance on the criminal side. That's Chief Prosecutor Miranda, and then 4 of us in the department sit in a conference room and go through it line by line and working on it. And we look at it from both a policy perspective and, of course, a drafting perspective. This is a criminal code. It has to be clear, it has to be unambiguous, and something that our prosecution team is comfortable with prosecuting in front of the judge. So that second session led to the draft that was submitted today to this committee. I know it came late today, but I can tell you this is something that is a front burner project for the law department. We work on it each week. And what we would propose, even the draft in front of you, we're not comfortable making it a substitute to the version that was submitted by council. But we're confident over the next 4 to 6 weeks, our next draft will be of sufficient extensive work and comprehension that, or comprehensive work that will propose that as a substitute in about 4 to 6 weeks. And then the committee can go through it line by line and address it and ask Ms. Miranda questions at that time as well, in addition tonight to do so. But just so you all know, what you have in front of you is continued work in progress, largely because of the good efforts of Ms. Miranda. So I think the Chief Prosecutor can talk to you about some example policy issues. There are some technical wordings, things that we are correcting, addressing, but they're not significant enough to discuss here. But maybe some of the examples of the policy issues, the substantive issues that Ms. Miranda has had to deal with and that we as a law department are working on drafting may make sense. So I'll turn it over to Ms. Miranda unless there's any questions for me from a big overview standpoint.
I guess high level, one question I would have, I don't know if before we get started, any other committee members or council members have questions, is how are we handling possession today? Just so we can understand, you know, I understand we want to take the time to make sure we get this right, but I also want to understand in the interim how members of, you know, the public are being treated on this topic.
Yes, I'm going to turn that over, but I think we did address it at the last committee. There is no risk to the citizens of Lakewood with respect to enforcement, anything inconsistent with the revised code of the initiated statute. But I'll have Ms. Miranda address that specifically. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Miriam Miranda, Chief Prosecutor for the city. Thank you for having me here tonight. I want to recognize council and the mayor in the process. So before I get into that particular question, I do want everyone to be aware of how we're approaching this future proposed legislation. So we are approaching it with the utmost respect for our citizens to exercise their rights within the, as you characterized it, overwhelmingly passed initiative. And so we're very cognizant of that. Unfortunately, the product that we've received from Columbus has many areas that have not been reconciled with the rest of the criminal code. So it's kind of fallen on us to try and figure out where some of those inconsistencies lie. How can we offer protection to our citizens and at the same time also enforce the laws of the state of Ohio and the city? So in doing that, we very carefully went through what Columbus brought to us, and then we started comparing some of those provisions to, and really talking about like how could this be affected? How can someone lose their privilege or maybe have a right to their adult use here, but maybe be exposed to prosecution unfairly, or maybe be exposed to prosecution fairly? and to try and make sense of all of that. We found, like I said, a few areas that have not been reconciled. And one of the, and then I'm going to kind of answer a little bit about your possession question. So right now, as we speak, here in the city of Lakewood, our police officers are not charging our citizens with personal use marijuana. It's just not happening. We're not charging with personal possession of marijuana paraphernalia either, as it pertains to what's commonly assumed to be paraphernalia. You know, paraphernalia is a term of art, and one of the reasons why we want to keep it in the code, because it will also include things like plows and shovels. And so if somebody is cultivating unlawfully, those instruments will also be contemplated by that particular ordinance. So I want the members of council to rest assured that you're not going to receive calls from your constituents complaining that a police officer from the city targeted them because they had some personal use marijuana. And it's just a decision that was made even before the adult use marijuana initiative passed by popular vote. It was done as a matter of practicality, to be honest with you, because for us, this minor misdemeanor was too costly because we had to send it to get tested to a lab, whether it was BCI or one other, any of the other labs, the medical examiner's office. And for personal use marijuana, it became just a cost-benefit decision at that time. Now we've also included this addition of protection that the law has wanted to afford folks with their adult use. But we can't ignore that adult use has limitations, and that adult use involves a responsible adult, an adult that follows the law. And so that has repercussions not only in the way that the person possesses the adult use amount of marijuana, but where that person consumes it, how that person transfers it, whether it's by gift or otherwise. And all of that conduct has to be contemplated by us. We are very zealous in protecting the peace and dignity of the city of Lakewood. And in doing so, we have to make sure that, while on the one hand, our ordinance is going to offer protections for that responsible adult consumer, it's also going to have penalties for those who don't follow their duties under adult consumption, whether that is just adult use or home grow, or we've already, and actually, it's not something that we're unfamiliar with. We've had medical marijuana here for a while. So our officers are trained also in asking the right questions. And I only envision that as we refine our adult use and home grow, our officers will receive training, most likely from myself and Andrew Flack, who's the assistant prosecutor. We generally do training sessions with the entire police force, usually at different roll calls, and we'll encourage them to follow a certain protocol of what kind of questions to ask when you encounter someone who is exercising their right to adult use or cultivation, to make the right legal calls, so that if things are not done well, depending on the circumstances, maybe there would be appropriate prosecution or warning. It's always up to the discretion of the officer, depending on the circumstances. But we can't lose sight of the fact that, you know, we have to reconcile both the interests of the public to maintain order and the peace and dignity of the city, and also the people's right to exercise their adult use consumption as allowed by law. I don't know if that answered your question, but I think,
It certainly did, thank you. And I guess, I think I know the answer to these questions, but I think they're helpful to talk about in a public setting. So, in reviewing the previous version, which I assume is similar to what was sent this evening, of the proposed ordinance but not yet substitute ordinance, there's provisions about distances from schools, about adult use, about making sure it's not done, I think, like in the public, it's being done in homes outside of the view of children. I think there's some provision in there about that. Can you explain, for both the council and just the public in general, what adult use is contemplated by the initiated statute and, you know, from a prosecutor standpoint, the law department standpoint, public safety perspective, how it would look in Lakewood? You know, I'm envisioning, I want to make sure people can responsibly, you know, use as an adult, but I don't, you know, I wouldn't want it next to a playground, right, when my kid's playing or whatever. So those are some of the tensions and kind of respectability you're talking about. So can you explain, you know, what bounds of use are outlined in the current initiated statute and where you think it's going and what we think we will have here in Lakewood?
so some of those restrictions on conduct that you mentioned are actually directly from the Ohio Revised Code. And the way that adult use will look like in Lakewood is, I'm going to give you an example. Like, John Doe wants to get some adult use. He's a qualified adult. He purchases at, let's say, the Rice dispensary, if, you know, when they get their adult use license. He's allowed to transport his purchase of the legal amount of marijuana from the dispensary to his home. In other words, if he gets stopped, there's no offense that he could be accused of by having the marijuana in his car. He can bring the marijuana into his home, and he can freely consume his marijuana at home, in his property. What he cannot do is consume it on the way home. He cannot consume marijuana in the vehicle. Okay, so that is prohibited conduct under the Revised Code. He cannot consume it in parks. He cannot consume it outside in public areas. Where it gets a little bit, I want to say delicate, is, and where I foresee maybe having some pushback from some citizens, is the law allows the person to consume at their property. Lakewood is a densely populated city. So I could see neighbors being a little bit annoyed by other neighbors' legal consumption of adult use marijuana. Now, let's say that John Doe also likes to cultivate his own plants. He is allowed to cultivate 6 plants of marijuana. Now, if he has anyone else living at his home, that other person can also cultivate 6 plants for a total of 12 plants per household. So if there are 5 adults who can legally consume adult use cannabis or marijuana, the household can only still cultivate up to 12 plants, no more than that. So there are some restrictions as to where the cultivation can happen. And I think that those are specifically outlined as to enclosures, and certainly, like I said, we all know we live in a densely populated city. We are a city that's growing in terms of families and young children. We never want to see somebody accidentally consuming marijuana because, you know, they, the child didn't know what they were doing or it was too accessible. So there are prohibitions as to, and restrictions as to how the plants can be cultivated in their home. And that's basically it. That's what consumption of adult use marijuana would look like in our city. I can't envision a situation in which our officers would be less than informed about that. What is not allowed is, you know, gifting marijuana to somebody over the amount, or lighting up your marijuana in public. Even if you're very happy and you're at the steps in Lakewood Park, you're not allowed to do it. You're not allowed to do these gifts around schools. And that's, I think, for obvious reasons. I think that there's also another public policy interest in terms of, you know, when I say the peace and dignity of the city, that means the whole city. And, you know, in terms of, we want this to be adult behavior that, you know, parents and will express their opinion and maybe teach their children what they are hoping their decisions will be when they're older. But this type of behavior is not supposed to happen in front of children that are not your own. So.
No, and I think, you know, part of the selling point for the initiated statute was regulate marijuana like alcohol, and you're not allowed to walk down Detroit Avenue with a beer. So you also won't be able to walk down Detroit Avenue while consuming marijuana. So that makes perfect sense to me. I've talked a lot here. Any other questions from my colleagues or members of the council?
Sure. Just a kind of 1,000-foot question here. In terms of our police department and their policies regarding search and seizure, it used to be you smell burnt marijuana, you'd be able to search the entire vehicle. Understanding that, yes, the law says it is prohibited to consume marijuana while you're in a vehicle, it may not be evidence. You wouldn't be able to tell when that consumption occurred if you just have the odor of raw marijuana. So has the police department revised any general police orders or any policies regarding searches of vehicle,
So
probable cause searches?
we call that the plain smell test usually, right? So it's not a blanket policy because like any search and seizure case, it's one case at a time. So there are certain plain smell cases that they go nowhere. We don't search them. Sometimes there's depending on what the officer perceives. If the officer stops a vehicle because it committed a traffic infraction and on rolling down the window, there's a whiff of smoke that comes out, and there is maybe a recently put out marijuana cigarette, of course, that's a different situation. But I can tell you that our officers received constant training about the latest standards of what is allowed, what the 8th District Court of Appeals says is allowed for search and seizure, and what our Supreme Court and federal courts say. And we are very, very zealous about keeping them updated.
Councilman Rader?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Prosecutor Miranda, Director Vargo. I appreciate the work on this. You'd mentioned that there was some thought, at least about, I didn't read in this version of the proposed but not quite yet substituted that you'd worked on, and I haven't gotten all the way through it, but are there any changes that do relate to marijuana use in the home or on private property? I'll say that go be above and beyond what the statute.
No.
Okay.
No. No. I think that we absolutely will mirror the state law and afford people the protections that state law is already affording them in terms of the legal consumption of adult-use marijuana in the home.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's important. I just know a lot of folks that voted for this, particularly in Lakewood, voted for that specifically to be able to home grow and be able to use their marijuana in their home, how they choose, would err on that side of things, certainly. So I appreciate that, and thank you for that clarity. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
If there are no other questions, or Mr. Bullock?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the good discussion here. So just some clarifying questions. So if I hear you correctly, the law department's goal here is to fully integrate into our local ordinances all of the new state, not only rules, but laws through the initiated statute, correct?
The short answer would be yes, with the only exception that we are proposing to integrate into our codified ordinance those laws that will be enforced here in the city. So the state still going to have the big picture, like a truck full of unlawful marijuana. That's going to be a felony. That's going to be contemplated by the trafficking and possession statutes that are already there. So we're not going to recreate or submit those provisions to you. Really, our purpose is to contemplate protection to our citizens that want to exercise their right to consume legally their adult use marijuana amounts and all the behaviors that are protected, but also include, as they relate to that behavior or to that consumption, all of the other provisions that people have to be aware of that would be then prosecuted here in Lakewood. Okay, so those are the ones that we are going to be proposing to you. For example, you can't smoke it in your car. That's going to be a local ordinance. Or certain restrictions on how and when and where you can gift marijuana to another adult user. What parents are responsible for in terms of, if they allow marijuana use in their homes. It's going to be very similar to alcohol with a few restrictions. Or juveniles that use fake IDs to get adult use marijuana. Or have somebody else buy the marijuana for them. So we have to contemplate those provisions too, because we are also tasked with protecting our juvenile population here until they can be adults and make adult decisions. So marijuana is called adult use for a reason. Marijuana is never, ever for any juvenile. You can't permit it in your home. You can't give it to a juvenile. You can't buy it for a juvenile. And you can't consume it with a juvenile. So.
Understood. So some of those details we just talked about that you just shared, are those in state statute that we're simply transposing to local ordinance, or are some of those things the fine details of how municipalities are allowed under home rule authority to implement policies as long as they're consistent with state statute?
Right. So we look to the state revised code for, we studied all of their provisions and incorporated those, or as maybe proposed legislation, to fulfill the bigger policy goal, which is protect people's rights to use and protect the peace and dignity of the city at the same time.
So there's some additional work. If we had the Venn diagram of the state statute and the city of Lakewood's, those are going to be largely or vast majority overlapping, given the way that state law supersedes local law, but there's still, it's not exact overlap, right? So there's a little area or a certain area where city law has some decisions to make about how that, those laws are going to be designed that, you know, and enforced. So that's really my question is how much of that discretionary portion of this design of law is what you're saying you're working on now? Or is it more just we've got to figure out how to work on the part where the state's setting the rules and we're just implementing them?
So going to your Venn diagram example, it's going to look more closely like a circle, okay, than two
Partly separated.
partly separated circles, yeah. Because we're trying to make sure that our local code is respectful of, you know, our state code. When it comes to some of the nuances, of course, you know, we have to take into consideration the way our city is, how it's configured, how close we live to one another here, without violating people's rights.
Yes. So you, where I'm driving with this is just you thinking about 6 weeks, the administration will have your answer to what that ought to look like. You'll have had a chance at that time to do an internal review, which includes how you're going to prosecute it, how you're going to enforce it, all that, and then we should be ready to go. I think I'm hearing from my colleagues some level of time sensitivity. Sounds like perhaps earlier than 4 weeks would be preference of some of my colleagues, although I'm not supposed to speak for anybody but myself, but I'm just inferring. So, you know, since it's also possible that the state legislature is going to circle back around eventually, maybe, and add its own inflection on the initiated statute that the voters put into place, we might be doing this in a couple rounds this year or the next 24 months, something like that. So would there be any drawback to act sooner than later, knowing that we might come back later this year with a refinement?
It's hard for me to answer that question, Councilman, because we are giving all of our effort to this project. We will submit to you what would be in conformity with the law, with the policy goals that we've already talked about. We are also frustrated, I'm going to tell you, with Columbus because they keep on changing, you know, the deadline, and we know that things may look very different 6 months from now. And we will have to, you know, revisit this and collaborate again in having to amend newly minted ordinances into our code. So of course there's a sense of, you know, we are working very hard. We don't know what Columbus is going to do or what this ultimately will look like, but we're up for the task.
Thank you.
And to my colleague's point, I do think there is a, it's cold comfort for folks sometimes when they're doing something that's technically legal by the state, but they're violating even unenforced city ordinances. So that's why I think you're hearing some expression of desire to move quickly, but we want to make sure we move prudently as well. And so I appreciate that. The one thing, getting to Councilman Bullock's point, that I think would be helpful is when we are ready, when the law department and the prosecutor is ready to come forward with the substitute ordinance, literally having that Venn diagram of this is what the state says, and this is where the parts of our proposed substitute ordinance align directly with state law. And these small area of things are things that we think are unique to Lakewood that we want to put in as misdemeanors because it's important for responsible use and for the general enjoyment of our public. So having that so that we can be clear, you know, on what, because that's really what our ability to affect policy is in that area, right? The state law is a state law, but the other areas, and I think we will align, I don't obviously only speak for myself, with what you propose, but I think it would at least be helpful for us to consider it as the policymakers for the city as to, you know, kind of whether we agree or not.
Very
So
well.
I think that would be helpful.
And Mr. Chair, I do want to compliment and thank Ms. Miranda on, I agree with your point about zealously protecting the city's peace, calm, and dignity. I mean, I think that is important. When it's working well, we tend to take things for granted. We really shouldn't. We appreciate that, and all the things you're talking about are right on target, I think. I mean, the spirit of the law is to recognize a new responsible private adult right under the law to this kind of recreational use. And there's a two-way street there, and I do recall, I thought it was a good way to summarize it. The vote on the ballot was regulate marijuana like alcohol. Well, alcohol has a bunch of limits on its legal use and also norms where we're supposed to be good neighbors and respectful citizens when we use alcohol, and that is obviously far from perfect. And that's a law that's been on the books for a century now, et cetera. So I do think it's fair for the city and the city council to put some thought to this question. We all, I think, are supportive of adult use, and it's legitimate to be thoughtful in how we unfurl this. Because, as I said at the previous meeting, I was at a playground, a public playground, and there was use at the playground, not adjacent to it, but at the playground while the kids are there, so.
And that's already against our code.
That definitely would be contemplated in our ordinance. One of the things that we encounter on the law enforcement end, where I am, is educating the public about their responsibilities. Really works. It really does. Not everybody's going to follow the law. That's why I have a job. But educating the public does generally work.
Well, I can certainly speak for myself when I say I appreciate the efforts of the law department and you, Ms. Miranda, in putting this together. And I do want to be mindful of the next committee that's scheduled for 6:45. So, and I appreciate and look forward to working with the law department over the next couple of weeks on this issue and having another discussion about it in committee. So without objection, I will adjourn the Public Safety Committee meeting and allow the chair of the next meeting to decide when he wants to start.